The fundamental tension at the heart of the American presidency isn't actually about which party holds the White House, but whether the person in that office acts as a sovereign or a constitutional steward. This distinction between a leader who demands personal loyalty to impose their will and one who operates within a system of expertise and institutional constraints is the central focus of a profound reflection we're looking at today. It's a perspective rooted not just in high-level political theory, but in the practical, high-stakes reality of incident management, where the difference between success and catastrophe often comes down to whether a leader creates an environment where experts can speak truth to power.
That practical grounding is what makes this so compelling. The reflection draws a direct line from the experience of a Type 2 incident management team, the groups that handle complex wildfires and natural disasters, to the highest office in the land. In that world, an incident commander is not a hero who knows everything. They're a facilitator who relies on specialists in operations, logistics, and safety. If they stop listening to the safety officer because the truth is inconvenient, people die. The argument here is that the presidency was designed to function the exact same way as a system of checks where no single person governs by personal certainty alone.
But isn't there a counter-argument that the modern world is too fast for that kind of collaborative management? You see this in the first model of leadership described, the sovereign. This model prioritizes decisive action, disrupting the swamp or the bureaucracy, and negotiating aggressively. For a lot of people, that looks like strength. They see a leader who can cut through red tape and get things done regardless of what some career bureaucrat says. Why is that model considered a threat to the constitutional framework rather than just a different style of efficiency?
Because the founders' greatest fear was exactly that kind of efficiency. They called it tyranny. They had just fought a revolution against a monarch who exercised power based on personal will. When you look at Article 2 of the Constitution, it doesn't actually describe a leader of the nation in the way we often talk about it today. It describes an office, a set of responsibilities. Legal scholars often point out that the Take Care Clause, which says the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed, was historically understood as a constraint. It wasn't a blank check to do whatever the executive wants. It was a mandate to follow the laws passed by Congress, even the ones they don't like.
That brings us to the specific developments mentioned, like the proposals in Project 2025 or the revival of Schedule F. For those who aren't in the weeds of federal personnel policy, Schedule F was an executive order that would have reclassified tens of thousands of career civil servants as at-will employees. The argument for it is accountability, that the president should be able to fire people who aren't carrying out their agenda. But from the perspective of this constitutional executive model, that looks less like accountability and more like dismantling the expertise that's supposed to check a leader's blind spots.
It's a fundamental shift. Since the Pendleton Act of 1883, we've moved away from the spoils system, where every new president just fired everyone and gave jobs to their friends. That act was passed specifically because the old way led to massive corruption and even the assassination of President James Garfield by a disgruntled job seeker. The professional civil service was built to ensure that the person managing the national forests or the person analyzing nuclear data doesn't change every 4 years based on who they voted for. When you replace that with a system based on personal loyalty, you're essentially telling the safety officer in that incident management team that their job depends on not contradicting the boss.
You also see this tension in the treatment of inspectors general. These are the internal watchdogs meant to root out waste and fraud within agencies. The data shows an unprecedented trend recently, the removal of more IGs than under almost all other presidents combined, often after they released reports critical of the administration. If you view the president as a sovereign, these IGs are obstructions or disloyal actors. But if you view the presidency as an institution, those IGs are the vital feedback loops that prevent the system from collapsing into error.
And the irony is that these watchdogs actually save money. A report from the Senate Homeland Security Committee found that the inspectors general fired recently had identified billions of dollars in potential savings, far more than any new efficiency commission. This gets to a deeper psychological point mentioned in the reflection, the influence of Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking on Donald Trump's leadership style. Peale's philosophy teaches that you should never entertain a failure thought and that confidence can literally change reality. That might work for a real estate developer or a self-help guru, but in a constitutional republic, the system is designed to do the opposite. It's designed to force the leader to look at potential failure, to listen to the dissent, and to weigh evidence that contradicts their optimism.
That's a fascinating connection. If your entire worldview is built on the idea that believing it makes it so, then an independent civil servant bringing you a report that says your policy isn't working isn't just a messenger. They're a threat to the positive thinking that you believe is the source of your success. It reframes disagreement as a kind of psychological betrayal or a failure thought that needs to be purged. But the founders didn't build a system that relied on the leader's internal mindset. They assumed leaders would be ambitious and imperfect.
Exactly. Madison famously wrote in Federalist 51 that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. They didn't want a wise king, they wanted a system strong enough to survive a foolish one. The worry expressed in this reflection is that we are witnessing the gradual hollowing out of that system. It's not one single event, it's the cumulative effect. It's the weakening of the courts, the reduction in staffing at agencies like the Forest Service, the marginalizing of scientific expertise, and the push to make the bureaucracy a tool of the president's will rather than a steward of the law.
There's also the cultural impact. When leadership is framed as a zero-sum game of strength and loyalty, it changes how the public evaluates the office. We start looking for strong men who promise to fix everything personally, rather than looking for stewards who can manage the complex machinery of a modern state. This reflects a shift from a republic, where the law is king, back toward a more primitive idea of the sovereign, where the king's word is law. The reflection suggests that the measure of a president isn't how much they change the country, but whether they leave the institutions of that republic stronger or weaker than they found them.
And history shows us that democracies rarely die in a sudden coup. They erode. They change gradually as people stop believing in the value of independent expertise and start valuing the will of the leader above all else. When you look at historical examples, from the expansion of executive power during the New Deal to the excesses of the Nixon era, there has always been a tension. But what's different now is the explicit philosophical movement, like what we see in Project 2025, to fundamentally bend or break the bureaucracy to the presidential will. That's not a policy disagreement, it's a structural one.
So if someone is listening to this and they feel that the government is indeed too big, too slow, and unresponsive to the voters, which is a common and legitimate grievance, how does the constitutional executive model answer that? Is the only option to just accept a sluggish, untouchable bureaucracy? Or is there a way to reform these institutions without turning the president into a sovereign?
That's the vital question. The constitutional answer isn't that the bureaucracy is perfect. It's that reform should happen through the legislature, the branch that actually represents the people and has the power to write the laws that govern these agencies. If the Forest Service isn't working, Congress can pass a law to change its structure, its mission, or its budget. That's accountability within the system. The sovereign model skips that part. It says, I don't need a new law. I'll just change the personnel rules until everyone left agrees with me. One is a reform of the rules. The other is a subversion of them. One respects the expertise needed to manage a wildfire. The other fires the fire scientist because they said the wind is blowing the wrong way.
It really comes back to that incident management analogy. In a crisis, the incident commander has immense authority, but that authority is only effective because it's supported by a structure of specialized knowledge. If the commander tries to do the logistics, the finance, and the safety monitoring all on their own, or only listens to people who tell them everything is fine, the fire wins. The Republic is a much larger, much more complex incident, and the Constitution is the operating manual that says you cannot do this alone. You must listen to the experts, you must follow the process, and you must respect the limits of your own vision.
The final takeaway here is that we should stop asking whether a leader is strong enough to impose their will. We should start asking whether they are strong enough to be told they are wrong. Are they comfortable with independent oversight? Do they value competence over loyalty? Do they see themselves as the master of the government or its temporary steward? Because, as the reflection ends, the Constitution wasn't written to create kings. It was written to create an executive who understands that preserving the republic, its courts, its civil service, its rule of law, is more important than preserving their own personal power.
It's a sobering look at what's at stake, moving beyond the daily headlines to the actual foundation of the country. If this conversation made you think about leadership in a new way, consider sharing it with someone who values the health of our institutions as much as you do.